So, all right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event, From Soil to Synapses, How Nurturing Nature Cultivates Human Cognition and Regulation, with Jill Mays, our guest. So without further ado, I will introduce Jill. Jill, just give me one moment here. I'm going to pull up Jill's bio. All right. So Jill is the author of Your Child's Motor Development Story, which highlights the importance of sensory exploration and natural play for healthy development. An occupational therapist specializing in sensory integration, her book, Nurturing Nature, A Guide to Gardening for Special Needs, focuses on the benefits of gardening. Working with farmers, she helped develop children's garden programs and currently leads garden groups for disabled adults. Jill lives with her husband, their Portuguese water dog, and a flock of chickens at the end of Cape Cod. Does that not sound idyllic? So, Jill, over to you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Okay, Alexis, thank you so much. I want to thank Root in Nature and especially Emily, who's worked with me since the summer to get this together. And thank you all of you for coming and joining. I'm especially impressed that someone all the way, Sandy, all the way from Australia is coming. So anyway, you might be the farthest away of anyone who's attended any of my talks so far. So that's great. Okay, so if we can get to the next slide, Emily, please. So tonight, what I hope to do is tell you a little bit about my gardening experiences and then how my work in the clinic and in occupational therapy and working with children and adults, how that sort of segued into seeing the benefits of gardening, and then sharing with you a lot of the information about how gardening helps physically, how the senses really activate things going on in the brain, and then widening the scope to how nature and gardening are just incredibly critical for our health and well-being. Then if there's time, we'll go through a little bit of the strategies for gardening, but I think you all are experts in a lot of that already. But anyway, okay, next slide, please. Okay, so my garden journey, as was mentioned, I was an occupational therapist. I worked in medical surgical units, rehab units, psychiatry, but I really landed in focusing on sensory integration and working with children. And so I had a pretty active career, and at a certain point, I ended up with 3 wonderful children. So between juggling a career and my kids, I had a special need. And my special need was that I was desperate for time alone, some peace and quiet, because I was from 6 in the morning till 1 o'clock at night, run, 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 run. And that was in the early 90s when just organic gardening and organic food was just becoming a real buzzy kind of topic. So I said to my husband, how about we get a garden? And he decided to get on board with that. And he did a lot of the heavy lifting of digging in to make a fence and planks in the ground, because we happen to live in a state surrounded by state forest, and we had a lot of critters around. And but we did find one small patch that was sunny most of the day, and so we did a this little tiny garden. So it took, I had a couple minutes in the evening sometimes and a couple hours during the day. And what I found is it was pure heaven. I had time to myself. It was quiet. I just loved the time I had in my garden. Now, I'm going to tell you the moment I knew that I couldn't garden, I had to abandon gardening at our home in Connecticut. So, as I mentioned, as an occupational therapist, I work with children. I had a home office. It was a beautiful day in June, and it was 1 o'clock. I was waiting for the appointment to come. And so I was looking at my garden, and there were green rows of green lettuce and red lettuce. And I thought, oh, I'm so excited we'll be able to have a fresh salad this weekend with my lettuce. So Jack came, we worked for an hour, and then he left, and I went over to the garden to look again. It was mowed down. There was nothing, not one leaf left. So whoever the critter was either heard me, read my mind, and knew it was going to be gone and figured he needed to take it fast. I'm not sure, but I was devastated. Now, my husband recognized how much I love the garden, and by that point we had acquired a small cottage at the far end of the Cape. And he said, you know what, I think I could build a box for you out there. And so uh, fast forward a bit, he did a box, 10 by 20, not a big garden, but because there's wonderful national seashore, there's lots of places for the critters to go. So we didn't have to worry too much about that. However, it's a sandbar where we live. So I needed to augment the soil. And so this was pre-Google days, which meant that I had to go to the library to get books to find out how to do all the kinds of gardening things I wanted to do. And the librarian by then, since it's such a small community, the librarians kind of knew everyone in town. And the librarian knew I worked with children, and she had figured out with the armloads of books I'd bring home every day, every week, that I probably was a gardener. And so she invited me to meet a woman who was in the back of the library where they had a little garden and there were kids running all over the place. And this was Francie Randolph, who was a co-founder of an organization called Sustainable Cape, which stands for Center for Agricultural Preservation and Education. And she had a true belief, a strong belief that the best way to get people to understand and love gardening is to start when they were young. And so they started, one of their first projects was starting a children's community garden. And so I became a volunteer there, working side by side with market farmers who ran the group. Now, next slide, please. So the first thing I learned when I was working with the children at the garden is that the gateway to eating vegetables for children is for them to grow their own food. So besides that, though, while I worked with the kids, I began to notice that the kinds of things that I worked on in the clinic and in consulting with teachers and parents in classrooms and whatnot, is that all the kinds of things I worked on were happening organically in the garden. Next slide, please. So, for instance, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, eye-hand coordination, bilateral motor coordination. A lot of the work as a sensory integration therapist I really worked on activating brain filters for better attention, helping with alerting and calming, reducing sensory overload, improving sensory tolerance. So these are all things that I really focused on in my clinic with balls and all kinds of equipment. But out in the garden, it was just happening. And of course, as you all know, with the work that you're doing, socialization and connection is happening when you're engaged in group gardening. There's the ability for parallel engagement when kids are still or adults are in a sort of socially, let's say, vulnerable. But then over time in the garden, it's sort of easy for them to move into more cooperative work. And then there's such pride in the projects in the children's garden that they did. At the end, they had a time for celebrating the harvest, and then they'd have goodie bags that they would bring home to the family, and they had real pride in being able to provide real food for their families and friends. Next slide, please. So I start with this slide because, of course, it's a plant sprayer, even though it's not spraying a plant right now. But I want to use this as an example of an activity that spans the lifespan. So gardening, I view, as something that can begin from the cradle right to the grave. Here with the plant sprayer is one of my favorite things in the therapeutic setting. The teachers used it. And the reason is because if you notice the way that little hand is stretched, some of the fingers are curled, are flexed, but some of the finger towards the hand is straighter, and the thumb is pulled way far away from the rest of the hand. And all of those things are that particular position activates and utilizes deep muscles in the hand that children do not have when they're very young. That's why you see, the little 2-year-olds have very doughy kind of hands. But then they get stronger by 4 or 5 because that's when their hands are developing those deep muscles. And then, of course, as we age, we use fewer because we only do certain activities. We may lose some of those muscles. So something like the plant sprayer is something that, there's the use it or lose it as you get older. And so it also works at the other end. While when children are very young, you're developing kinds of motor skills and muscle strength, etc. And at the older end, you're looking at a preservation of it. Next slide, please. So getting back to be more specific about how gardening helps with all the different areas of motor control. So for instance, anyone who does Pilates or yoga might be familiar with this position where, you have to kind of squat down and balance, and it's a huge core strengthener, and it also requires balance. So this kind of gives you a good sense about the gross motor control that's required. In gardening, when you're reaching, you're standing up, you're kneeling down, you're digging, you're doing all kinds of things that strengthen all the core muscles and also the arms and again the hands. The other thing that will happen, you notice this one is also looking at the pumpkin. So you've got visual attention happening. The hands are feeling the pumpkin. So you've got tactile input going on. So there's a whole lot of things that are going on when you're working in the garden. The other thing is this child is holding this pumpkin with two hands. So I want to talk a little bit to begin with about bilateral motor coordination. We know about this for gross motor skills, how important it is for a lot of sports. So we think about it typically that way, and that is important. But there's another way that it's really, really critical. Using two hands together simultaneously activates all different levels in the nervous system. So as both sides of the body are working together, there's crisscrosses that are going on in the spinal cord, all the way up into the brain, into the higher cortical, where there's something called the corpus callosum, which is this major highway between the two hemispheres. And so why is that important? Because the more you're getting crisscrossing information, you're developing pathways in the brain. And what are pathways about? Pathways are all about communicating connections, and which is critical for learning. So that's something that I did in the clinic all the time, and it happens all the time in the garden. When you're raking, when you're shoveling, these things all require bilateral motor coordination. Next slide, please. So along with the motor kind of component that really we need to develop to remain healthy, there's all kinds of things that are going in the sensory system. And I'm going to go through just sort of a quick shot of what the things are, and then we'll go into deeper detail as we speak through the night. Vision is an attention kind of alerting type of input. Hearing, we know, is a mood regulator. And smell is a memory and pleasure thing. Movement is alerting. We know this, like the seventh inning stretch, and you need to have, we have intermission at shows, things like that, because when you move, again, you kind of get reactivated. The vestibular system, we know about that for balance, but it's also hugely pervasive in terms of us engaging in the world. And then proprioception, that is something that helps with filters and attention, which I'll get into more detail later. Touch is a highly alerting input, but it's also so important in terms of, again, exploring the world. And taste, of course, we know is alerting, and hopefully most of the time it's a pleasure. Next slide, please. So let's talk about vision to begin with. So I'm using a butterfly as an example because the children and the people in the adult garden group that I have run for several years love to watch the butterflies. Of course, as a sustainable practice at the children's garden that we work at, they have lots of milkweed and butterfly bushes because we want to help all of the butterflies, and especially the monarch butterflies. So what is so wonderful about the butterflies visually? Well, of course, they stay still for a long time, and you can see beautiful colors and patterns. and then they fly, and then you have to do visual tracking. So you have all kinds of things going on in terms of visual activation happening. Next slide, please. So what is it about vision and nature? Um, so um, what they found, Florence Nightingale, back in the 1800s, she discovered that patients that had view that were able to go outside or see the outside would get better faster than people who were stuck inside and had no visual awareness of the outside. So fast forward to the 1980s, and there was a scientist named Ulrich who did a study at a hospital where he looked at patients that all had the same surgical procedure. Half of them had rooms looking at trees, and half of them had rooms looking at a brick wall. So guess who got better faster? So all the measures, less medication, faster to recover, faster discharge, all happened for the ones who saw the trees. So he thought that was interesting, and he decided he'd do a study. He thought there must be something about just looking at nature that causes people to have better well-being. So he decided to run a study, and I'm calling it the nature stress out study. So this is what happened. He had a group of people, and he took all the kind of stress markers to get a baseline. So things like heart rate, blood pressure, and they drew blood to get cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, is sort of happens when you're stressed out. So he had the baseline. Then he put them all in a room, and they had to look at a whole bunch of horrible, gory pictures. And they found that they then did the testing again, and indeed, everyone got totally stressed out. And so then he divided the group in half. Half of them went into a room and looked at nature pictures, and half of them went into a room and looked at urbanscapes. Nothing gory, just, bridges, roads, buildings, whatever. When they came back an hour later, the ones who had seen the nature pictures, they did all the measures again, and they were right down to baseline again, totally de-stressed. The other guys that looked at buildings and whatnot, they ended up continuing to be pretty highly stressed out. So that was an interesting study. And you have to wonder, what is it about nature, or about looking at nature scenes that makes people calmer and feel better? Well, if you think about human existence, Homo sapiens, they estimate it was about 300,000 years ago that they came on the planet scene. It was anyway. And so in terms of actual development civilization, even if you go back to the ancient, Egyptians and whatnot, it's like 2,000, 3,000 years ago. It's just a tiny sliver of the existence of human beings. So our brains were really, really wired up to be visually to be looking at nature patterns. Some of you may be familiar with fractals that people find are very, very interesting, like snowflakes and ferns that you have repeating waves and mountain ranges. Anyway, I go into more detail in that in the book. But it turns out, for instance, back before civilization, if you saw water, it meant you could survive. You would have something to drink so you wouldn't perish. And so water is something that's a very, very calming, soothing thing, as is the rest of nature. So the human brain is wired for looking at nature, and it's a calming thing versus when you see kind of buildings and things like that, that's the brain has to work harder. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back to the group, the capabilities group. Capabilities is an umbrella group for disabled adults on Cape Cod. And so it goes from, helping to get work placements, work training, right down to adult daycare. And so I run a group during the nice weather, comes once a week. And we pretty much begin with a stroll of the garden. The library now has an edible garden. And the first thing that we do as we're walking along is we look at, we have the visuals of the supplies, etc. And then I pick mint and lemon balm and I have them all smell it. So I'm starting to activate the olfactory system smelling. So what happens with the olfactory system is that the smells shoot straight up to the olfactory bulb in the brain, which is right next to the limbic system, which includes the amygdala and the hippocampus. And the amygdala is very involved with strong emotion, and the hippocampus has a lot to do with memory. So we're starting to activate that as we're walking along. The other thing is, as you can see from this picture, that it's not like a really firm surface. So for some of the folks, it really actually is a balancing activity for them as well. So we're starting to activate, and of course we're moving, even though it's a gentle stroll, we're still energizing. So we're getting more and more connected. Next slide, please. So some of the cons, and let me just say that also after we do that, we do a task, and then we do like a garden task like weeding, and then what we do after that is a project so that they can always take something home with them. So what are some of the common problems that we encounter in this group? There's low physical endurance, which I've mentioned. Sensory overload will happen. A lot of the people are like, when it's time to dig in the dirt or do some weeding, it's like, oh, I can't touch that. No, I can't do that. And so that's something that we need to work on. Sounds, sometimes there's sensitivities to that. And of course, there is a lot of sound in the garden that happens with out on the Cape, there's wind, and then there's all these other wonderful things like bird song and things like that. Some of the people are visually distracted. They may be insecure in their movements, as I said, walking on a pathway that is not, really firm and steady it's a bit of a challenge for them. There tend to be some cognitive and functional limitations, so we need to work on breaking down tasks in a way which are successful for them. And a lot of socialization and connectedness initially in the group is pretty limited. And so, we work on facilitating verbalization and engagement with others. And then there are some adaptations that are used when we have people who are physically or visually impaired. Next slide, please. So, for instance, with the people that say, oh, I can't weed, no, that's too much work, that's hard, I'll say, fine. You know what? I understand. Let's do 5 times, I'll count. Grab 5 weeds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yay, it's a great job. Congratulations. Of course, the next week I say 10, etc. And so by the end of the season, we'll have the group being able to clear out like a whole bed in one session of 10 or 15 minutes or so. So there's really nice growth in that way. The people who are like, I can't touch anything, once there's an assurance that well, one is sometimes they need to have gloves, and that's an easy solution. The other, but frequently all I do is I say, you know what, as soon as we're done with this test, you can go inside and wash your hands. And that's usually all they need. Sometimes just having, a towel or something nearby that they can wipe their hands is what they can do. But another thing that happens in the garden is that there's so much other sensory stuff happening that they get between the visual and the hearing things and smelling things, that's enough to disrupt the discomfort of the touch. So for instance, in the clinic, those are things that I would work on, is having children get distracted as they're putting their hands in a bean box or something like that, helping them learn to cope. But it happens again organically in the garden. And then the engagement, really we move from parallel to cooperative. First of all, the great news is when you're weeding, you don't have to interact with the weed other than to pull it out. And you might be weeding next to another person, but you don't really need to engage with that person either. But over time, as we work on our little projects, things like people who initially were very standoffish will start to like help hold a pot while the other person puts soil into the pot, things like that. Next slide, please. So we really start to get some really nice engagement on many levels socially. And of course, as we're doing these things, we have a lot of conversation and things going on as well. So I'm jumping back to the children's programs. Um, the community garden was so successful that we decided to expand to a farmer in the school program, and they asked me to help. I volunteered to help for a full day with a market farmer who was also an educator. And she created a wonderful curriculum spanning preschool through the sixth grade. And I think late I wasn't involved, but middle school also. But anyway, I was working with her one day it with the sixth graders. And now they had to move the compost from a huge pile to all the beds. That's a lot of heavy work. So you'd think they'd be like, oh, come on, whatever. No, you would think they were at a rock concert. They were so pumped up and excited. And I'm like, well, this is really fascinating. And then I had the epiphany. They were doing heavy work. These are adolescents. Their brains are like on fire with hormones and everything else. And so this was something that was helping them feel better. Now, how do I mean that? So when I'm in the clinic working with kids, I have them doing what we call heavy work, crab walking, wheelbarrow walking, jumping on little trampolines, jumping, you name it. In the classroom, I have the teachers having them pushing bins of workbooks, like lots and lots of heavy work. Why? Because it activates the joints. It's hard work on the joints. And what is that about? The nerves in the joints are called proprioceptors. Now, neurologists know that proprioceptors are about awareness, body awareness. So a test that the neurologist would do to test this is they'd have you close your eyes and they put your hand up in the and say, is your hand up or down? And you don't need to look. You can feel your hand is up in the air. That's because the proprioceptors are working. Now, what happens is those nerves shoot up to the brain and they activate what we call inhibitory neurons. So there's like the excitatory ones that send messages up here and there and connectors. Inhibitory neurons are like Super Mario, where you're going, don't need that, don't need that. Keep in mind that our brains are bombarded with like uh, sometimes I've read people saying a billion signals a second. Like, how could you possibly process all that? So you absolutely have to have a good filter in your brain to be a good filtering system to manage all of that. And of course, a lot of people have trouble managing all the input coming in. And so activating that system, the more you can activate it, the better it is. Next slide, please. So proprioception is an absolutely huge, wonderful benefit to all that hard work that we have in gardening. So what happens with the garden is that you have an explosion of sensory stimuli. We've talked about the visual. With sounds, they've we are all familiar with, there's so much studies about, different kinds of sounds to create different moods, calming you down, getting you excited, arousal. So it does a lot of things. Recent studies have found that bird song is something that, not identifying it, just hearing bird song in the background actually makes people feel happy. So, and then there's a lot of studies, I mention a lot of these in the book, but we don't have time to go into them, but that mechanical urban type sounds can be very harmful to people in terms of cognition and mental health and whatnot. And gardens, of course, muffle that. So they've also looked at studies doing that. But gardens are beautiful and they attract birds. There's lots of sounds that happen. For each of the senses in my book, I list the kinds of plants that augment that kind of sense, and also what the senses are that do it. So, for instance, what was I going to say about that? Yeah, so in terms of the different kinds of plants that make interesting sounds, etc. Anyway, we've talked about movement already, and then I've talked a little bit about touch. Touch is very complex, though. Smells and touch are the first systems that develop in the human body and the baby, and it's the first way that they relate in the world. And touch helps us explore the world, but there's also a protective part of touch, which is very important. And really worked when we were in the jungle, where, if you felt light touch, that meant you better run, fright, flight type of stuff. But but you need to be able to override that system. and some people don't, and they stay in a highly heightened, stressed state. So when I've talked about people in my groups that had difficulty touching, and that needed to be mitigated, and the gardening really helped, that's really critical because people who are uncomfortable with touch, it impairs their ability to explore the world, to be engaged socially, and they live in a higher level of stress all the time, which is very bad for their health. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Um, we'll stay there. It's okay. But the other thing with the multisensory is that neuroscientists have found that the more multisensory loaded an activity is, the more effective learning is, and also for memory. So those are, two big wallops in terms of things for children and also for people as we get older and we start to worry about where do we put our keys, et cetera, et cetera. So the gardening is great for that. Okay, I want us to kind of expand our focus for a few minutes beyond the garden and talk a little bit more about health benefits of nature in general. The reason I decided to write this book is when I started reading the studies about what nature is doing for our health, just blew my brain away. And I was like, oh, and I'm a kind of wonky and I like to, read this stuff, but a lot of people don't necessarily want to read this kind of information. So I felt it was really important to figure out a way to do this. So in the book, I have fun facts about different studies and this is and that's, but I'm going to highlight the couple that I think are really remarkable here tonight. Um, so I already mentioned how we know that looking at nature really makes us feel better. And studies have shown that when you are like even just so now that we have EEG cap, I call them EEG caps. They have mobile EEG, so you can actually see what's happening in people's brains as they're walking along. And so they've had studies where people are walking on an urban street, and then they literally just go a couple yards into the park, and they shift from beta waves, which are the hard thinking waves in the brain, to alpha waves, which are like the meditation, yoga, relaxation. So it just takes moments for the brain to shift from one to the other. Now, we in Canada and the United States live in beautiful countries that fortunately still have a lot of very beautiful areas and hopefully it'll happen more, but most cities still have, there are ways to access nature. Japan has a problem. 92% of its population is urban, which mean and it's a highly stressed population, and they recognize that they need to do something about it because it's a real problem for their health. So they've taken people into the forest. Some of you may have heard of forest bathing, but I'll quickly mention kind of what it is. Forest bathing is where people go into a wooded park, the forest. They go with a guide who is good at meditation or something, and they take them through ways of just inhaling and looking at and thinking about nature. And they do the measures similar to the stress out nature study that I mentioned earlier, looking at stress levels, et cetera. One of the researchers was a doctor that was an immunologist, Dr. Lee, and he wanted to take the studies further. They have definitely documenting that it was going into nature was a de-stressor in many, many levels. He decided to investigate whether it also had an impact on the immune system. Being an immunologist, that made sense. So he took a group of businessmen out to the forest and had them walk around for 3 days. And he did all this before he did that. He did the baseline of all those measures that we've talked about, blood pressure, cortisol. When he drew the blood, though, he also looked for the count of something called NK cells. Now, NK stands for natural killer cells. So it's just like what it sounds like. They're like heat-seeking missiles that go zooming all over the body looking for disease. So bacterial infections, viral infections, and cancer. So the more NK cells you have, the better. So he had their baseline. After 3 days, he drew blood again, and the NK cells went up 40%. That is a huge number. And now they had a control group that was in the city doing the same activities. So he would rule out that it was exercise that was causing that. Their NK cells did not change at all. So he said, there's something going on in the forest. And so he then decided, he had a suspicion that it was the aerosols coming from the cypress trees, they were in a cypress forest. So he took another smaller group and locked them in hotel rooms for 3 nights. One of the groups had vaporized air with water, vaporized water, and the other group had vaporized water infused in cypress oil. So all they did is just go there and sleep. That's the only thing. And after 3 days, the ones that had the cypress oil infused vaporized air, their NK cells went up 20%. So he really was like, yep, bingo. So then he wanted to take it one step further. He went back to the lab. He put cypress essential oil into petri dishes, and after a certain amount of time, it was a proliferation of NK cells, but also all kinds of other anti-cancer agents. So, wow, that was when I was like, wow, this is incredible to think that all you have to do is, stand next to a tree. And if I can have the next slide, please, Emily. Thanks. So the trees are magical. They help calm you down. They make you healthier. And so then you think, well, okay, so why do we bother gardening? What are we doing it for? Let's just stand in front of trees and life will be good. Well, next slide, please. And here's one of the reasons: dirt. It turns out that dirt actually has all kinds of microorganisms in it that make you healthy. And the book goes into detail, but again, I won't have time to go into what they are, but it's really pretty unbelievable. The pharmaceutical industry has made a whole lot of money on the stuff that's just sitting right there in the dirt. There's another study in which they had exposed some rats, rodents, I think it was rats though, to soil, and then they went into a maze, and they performed better than the rats that did not get exposed to soil. So, we are not rodents, but on the other hand, I will say that the kids that were digging around in the dirt at the children's garden and at the school, you have no idea how curious and the questions and the connections they were making. It was really pretty impressive. So you have to wonder about that. And then again, in the garden, you have this incredible multisensory environment, which really, we've already talked about all the benefits of that beyond just looking, but, engaging in it. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've been talking about, in general, kind of for children, and of course, I hope you can see the correlation to as we get older. For healthy people, you're getting a great benefit. But for those people, vulnerable populations that really live in stress and like lower health in a lot of different measures, gardening can amplify the benefits for them, but it's harder. It might be harder for them to be engaged. So I wanted to, and there have been lots of studies about different garden programs for different populations and how it improves self-esteem and, all kinds of things. But I want to zoom in on two different populations. One is the autism spectrum group, and there have been studies in which they have had children on the spectrum who have engaged in garden programs, participated in garden programs. And what they found is that their emotional IQ, which includes self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, social skills, and also social IQ, which relates to communication and the ability to initiate and completion of tasks and improvements in adaptive behaviors. All of those things improve when they engage fully in garden programs. So that's one group. And, that's a large group of people that we're all very concerned about. And the other group that I think is a huge concern right now are people struggling with dementia. And there were some studies that I was particularly fascinated with related to wander gardens. Some of you may be familiar with them. Um, what they are the enclosed gardens attached to a facility. So there's easy access from the facility out into the garden. Of course, they make the pathways easy to navigate through and they're safe. They make sure the plants are edible or non-toxic. So in case people are getting confused and eating things, they'll be fine. And so there's a very comprehensive study that I write about that has that they found that again they had the pre-entering before the Wander Garden was completed, so they had all of the baseline information on behaviors, et cetera. And then they monitored over a year of the people, how long people would stay in the Wander Garden. And what they found is the more time they spent in the Wander Garden, the more their behaviors improved, the less antipsychotic medications they needed. Family members noted that they seemed to be much happier, and there were lots and lots of other measures. So it was very impactful. The other thing that I thought was fascinating is an inverse relationship, direct inverse relationship. The more time that a patient spent in the Wander Garden, the less falls they had. So they didn't do any gardening, they didn't do any exercising. All they did is literally wander through the garden, and yet somehow that really helped them in so many dimensions. Next slide, please. So I think that you all have probably fair awareness of this, but I will just sort of zip through quickly ways to access for the people who do struggle with physical issues, people obviously with physical impairments, but then again, a lot of the people that I was working with just aren't very strong. And so things like stand-up table, these raised table beds are really great. They can sit there and work. Wheelchairs can tuck under it. Next slide, please. But, we think about the traditional garden, raised beds, that's all great. But the other thing is that's a lot of work and maybe is a lot of resources. The other thing you can do is just think out of the box and literally using boxes or any kind of container, go into your basement, your garage, pull out some containers that you have just lying around. Yeah, you hammer some holes in for drainage and you're good to go. So, and then you can put these planters in places that are more accessible. Next slide, please. Vertical gardens are another great way to go because especially for people who are visually impaired, it makes it easier for them to see. And again, for physically impaired people, it's much easier. The other thing that you can do is you can put, there are planters, they're a little pricey, or you can, that have casters on them. So you can just move them to people for them to work. And or put them on, they're pretty pricey. So the other thing is just having a cheap dolly and just plunking a pot on that and moving it around. And then you can of course have different layers, different shelving and things. There's all different ways to make things more accessible. Next slide, please. In the book, I have a whole bunch of different activities throughout the year. So that's we don't need to go through any of that though. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so essentially what I hope that everyone can recognize is that beyond, no matter how big or small you want to go with gardening, for instance, another study has shown that just having a live plant in a hospital room makes, again, that's the case in which people seem to recover faster. So just whether it's just a windowsill with some plants in it, a couple of pots, for the city, having, again, on a windowsill, if you have a little balcony, if you have access to rooftops, There's some wonderful information out there about rooftop gardens that are really, really amazing. I don't, Jennifer Jewell with Cultivating Place, she actually interviewed someone who develops these unbelievable uh, rooftop gardens, like whole hospitals with meadows. It's fascinating. And obviously that's another whole dimension and discussion. But there are lots of ways to be creative in terms of getting involved in gardening, no matter how small a scale you want to do. I also recommend if you are just getting started, starting smaller, small kinds of activities first, and then you expand. I started out as I started with my garden journey with a 10 by 20 box out here on the Cape. I'm up to like 20 large boxes with all kinds of ridiculous. It's like crazy how much I'm doing now. I don't know that I recommend that to anyone, but I can't help myself. Um, but anyway, I guess I have found gardening to be an incredibly healthful thing for myself. It connected me to our community so much better than I ever would have moving out here when I did 13 years ago. Um, so gardening is something that I find if we nurture nature, nature will nurture all of us as well. And that's pretty much what I have to say about it. And I hope if there's any, happy to have questions. I think we have enough time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was fascinating, a really wonderful presentation. I'm sure everybody learned something. I certainly did. For me, one of the biggest aha moments was